Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Most people think the Boston Tea Party was just about angry colonists tossing tea into the harbor in a rebellious tantrum. But what if I told you it was far more than that, a calculated move? In a larger revolutionary strategy that would ripple across the globe and change the course of history? This wasn't just about tea, it was about control, resistance, and a growing fury over economic oppression. In the shadows, secret societies like the Sons of Liberty were orchestrating acts of defiance, fueling a movement that would ignite an entire revolution. The Boston Tea Party was the spark, but the powder keg had been building for years. In this video, we're diving deep into the layers behind that iconic night, the economic tensions that set it all off, the underground groups that planned it, and the worldwide impact that followed. This is the story you didn't get in your history class. Colonial life before the Boston Tea Party was like standing in the eye of a storm, outwardly steady, but with trouble brewing just beyond the horizon. The towns bustled with activity. Ships offloaded goods at busy harbors, markets hummed with trade, and taverns were filled with spirited conversation. But beneath this surface of normalcy was a deepening anger, an unease that threaded its way through every colony, from the northern ports of Boston to the plantations of the South. The spark behind this growing unrest was Britain's massive debt from the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. Though the British had emerged victorious, the war had left the crown financially drained. Parliament saw the American colonies not just as part of the empire, but as a convenient source of revenue. After all, hadn't the war been fought partly to protect them? It seemed only fair, from the British point of view, that the colonies help shoulder the cost. So they passed a series of taxes and laws that slowly chipped away at colonial autonomy. The Sugar Act of 1764 taxed molasses and other goods. The Stamp Act of 1765 placed a fee on legal documents, newspapers, and even playing cards. And then came the Townshend Acts, targeting everyday imports like glass, paper, and tea. These weren't just financial burdens. They were symbolic reminders that the colonies were subject to the will of a distant parliament where they had no representation. At first, the response was measured: petitions, formal protests, and boycotts. But as these efforts were ignored or met with force, the colonists began to see these taxes not just as unfair, but as part of a larger pattern of exploitation and control. British troops stationed in American cities only added to the tension, especially in Boston, where their presence was seen as an occupation. Skirmishes, like the Boston Massacre in 1770, showed just how quickly things could erupt. The colonies were no longer just British outposts. They were evolving into something new, something restless. The growing merchant class in cities like New York and Philadelphia, the self-sufficient farmers in the countryside, the intellectuals writing fiery pamphlets, all were beginning to think differently about their place in the world. Liberty, once a vague ideal, was becoming a rallying cry. By the time Britain passed the Tea Act of 1773, which allowed the struggling British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting colonial merchants, it wasn't just about the price of tea. It was about principle, about whether the colonies would accept being governed without a voice. So while the streets of colonial cities might have looked busy and bright in the years leading up to the Boston Tea Party, the truth was far darker. Every tax, every law, every redcoat marching through the streets added fuel to a growing fire. And soon that fire would erupt into one of the most iconic acts of rebellion in American history. It started with the Stamp Act in 1765, a direct tax on printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. Colonists, who had no representation in Parliament, were outraged. The rallying cry, "No taxation without representation," echoed from taverns to town halls. Though the Stamp Act was eventually repealed, the damage was done. Then came the Townshend Acts, taxing goods like glass, paper, paint, and, most infamously, tea. It wasn't just about the money, it was about power. The British government was tightening its grip, and the colonists felt it. Every cup of tea became a symbol of submission, and refusing to drink it was an act of rebellion. Tea, once a staple of colonial life, took on a new meaning. Boycotts spread. Smuggled Dutch tea became a quiet act of defiance. The beverage, once associated with refinement and British culture, now represented oppression and resistance. Colonists weren't just upset about taxes, they were pushing back against an empire they saw as unjust and unyielding. Tea, once a symbol of everyday comfort and British refinement, transformed into a flashpoint for revolution. It wasn't just about the drink itself, it was about what it represented. Every sip of taxed tea became a bitter reminder of colonial subjugation. The Tea Act of 1773, designed to rescue the flailing British East India Company by granting it a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, was the final straw for many Americans. Though it technically made tea cheaper, it bypassed local merchants, tightening Britain's economic grip and reminding colonists that decisions about their lives were being made an ocean away. To the British, the law was practical. To the colonists, it was a trap, a cleverly disguised attempt to force acceptance of Parliament's right to tax them without consent. If they bought the tea, they acknowledged Parliament's authority. If they refused, they risked confrontation. The colonies chose defiance. Boston became ground zero. Night after night, meetings in Faneuil Hall and the Old South Meeting House grew louder, more determined. Protesters, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, warned that the tea ships in the harbor would not be allowed to unload. Colonial officials, however, refused to send the tea back. And then, on the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men, some disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded the ships. With calculated precision, they opened 342 chests of tea and dumped them into Boston Harbor. No theft, no violence, no casualties, just a powerful message. We will not be controlled. The tea floated like confetti on the black water, but its political weight was immense. It was a carefully orchestrated act of rebellion, bold, symbolic, and impossible for the crown to ignore. What Britain saw as criminal destruction, the colonists saw as a declaration. In that moment, the harbor truly did become a battlefield, not of weapons, but of will. The Boston Tea Party turned protest into open defiance and set the colonies on an irreversible course toward revolution. It wasn't just about tax anymore. It was about freedom, representation, and a new identity separate from the empire. The tea had sunk, but the message was rising. By 1773, tensions between Britain and the colonies had reached a boiling point. And then came the Tea Act, an act that many misunderstood, even at the time. Contrary to popular belief, the Tea Act of 1773 didn't raise taxes on tea. In fact, it actually lowered the price. But that wasn't the problem. Exactly, and that's what made the Tea Act so explosive. On the surface, it looked like a good deal, cheaper tea for colonists. But underneath, it was a political Trojan horse. By letting the East India Company sell directly to consumers, the British government wasn't just helping a company, it was making a power move. It cut colonial merchants out of the equation, sent a clear message about who really controlled trade, and dared the colonies to accept it. The East India Company wasn't just any business. It was a mega corporation with its own army, global reach, and deep ties to the British government. This wasn't free market competition. It was a state-sponsored monopoly, backed by Parliament and enforced by British law. To many colonists, it felt like the Crown was using corporate power as an extension of imperial rule, and that hit a nerve. Local merchants stood to lose their livelihoods. Consumers were being manipulated into supporting a political agenda just by buying tea. And activists like the Sons of Liberty understood that if this tactic worked, it would set a dangerous precedent. Britain could control colonial economies with the stroke of a pen. Worse still, the act wasn't debated or voted on by any colonial legislature. No input, no consent, just an edict handed down from across the Atlantic. That's why the outcry wasn't just economic, it was ideological. Colonists saw the Tea Act as part of a larger pattern of control without representation, of being treated like subjects instead of partners in the empire. By targeting tea, something consumed daily in nearly every household, Britain turned a basic commodity into a political flashpoint. And that's what made the Boston Tea Party so powerful. Dumping the tea wasn't just a protest against taxation. It was a rejection of imperial overreach, corporate collusion, and the erosion of colonial autonomy. In other words, it wasn't about the tea. It was about who held the power and who didn't. Local merchants who had built their livelihoods importing tea and other goods were suddenly cut out of the market. Their businesses threatened, their independence under siege. The colonists knew that accepting the tea meant accepting Parliament's right to dictate their economy. That to them was unacceptable. John Adams' words perfectly encapsulated the essence of the Boston Tea Party and the deeper ideological struggle that had been growing throughout the colonies. It wasn't just a matter of rejecting a tax on tea, it was a stand against the very principle of being ruled by an external power without consent. The act of resistance was about sovereignty, self-determination, and the belief that the colonies had the right to govern themselves without interference from a distant crown. Every ship carrying tea wasn't just delivering a product, it was a symbol of imperial control and the subjugation of colonial rights. The colonists understood that accepting the tea would be tantamount to accepting Britain's dominance over every aspect of their lives. The Tea Act was a direct challenge to their autonomy, and the only way to oppose it was through a powerful act of defiance, one that would send a clear message that they would not bow to tyranny. The decision to destroy the tea was symbolic on many levels. It was not only about the financial blow it struck to the East India Company, it was about sending a resounding statement of rejection. The crates of tea cast into the cold waters of Boston Harbor were filled with outrage. Outrage at being treated as subjects rather than citizens. Outrage at the heavy hand of British authority that saw the colonies as nothing more than an economic asset. It was a moment of collective consciousness, where the frustration of many merged into a single act of defiance, a refusal to submit. In that moment, the fight for liberty became much more than a protest. It became a revolutionary act. The message was clear. The colonies would no longer allow their rights to be trampled by a distant empire. They had chosen their path. The Boston Tea Party was more than a symbolic rejection of taxes. It was the first loud step toward full independence, and it sparked the revolutionary fire that would soon consume the entire continent. The colonists weren't just resisting taxes, they were standing up for the freedom to govern themselves. The night of December 16, 1773, was more than just a protest. It was a declaration of war against British tyranny. As the sun set over Boston Harbor, the city was about to witness an act of defiance that would echo through history: the Boston Tea Party. The Sons of Liberty were indeed the driving force behind the escalating resistance in the colonies, and their actions would forever change the course of American history. This secret society was composed of men who recognized the need for organized, direct action against British tyranny. They were not just agitators. They were skilled organizers, strategists, and communicators, uniting a broad cross-section of colonial society in the fight for liberty. At the heart of the Sons of Liberty were passionate leaders like Samuel Adams, whose deep conviction and persuasive voice made him a rallying figure for colonial resistance. Adams was not just a political leader, he was a master of mobilizing the masses. His ability to galvanize public opinion through pamphlets, speeches, and calls for action turned him into one of the most influential figures in the pre-revolutionary period. He was the one who tied the Tea Act to the larger issue of colonial autonomy, framing it as a direct assault on the liberties of the colonists. Then there was Paul Revere, known to most for his midnight ride to warn the colonial militias about British troop movements. But Revere's contributions went far beyond that. As a member of the Sons of Liberty, he was involved in organizing resistance efforts and spreading intelligence. He also played a critical role in the Boston Tea Party itself, ensuring that the protest was carried out swiftly and with precision. Revere's skills and craftsmanship as a silversmith gave him the perfect cover as he moved in and out of the cities, often carrying messages and coordinating with other members of the group. The Sons of Liberty weren't just about symbolic acts of protest, they were about strategy, planning, and execution. They organized boycotts of British goods, led public demonstrations, and carried out direct actions like the Boston Tea Party, which would become a pivotal moment in the resistance. They turned protests into calculated, high-impact actions designed to expose the injustice of British policies, and their influence began to spread across the colonies. Their efforts were instrumental in turning local resistance into a unified colonial movement. The message they conveyed was clear: the colonies would no longer tolerate the encroachment of British authority. The Sons of Liberty were the spark that would ignite the Revolutionary War, transforming public outrage into organized action, laying the groundwork for the Declaration of Independence and the eventual fight for American freedom. On that fateful night, around 7 p.m., a group of about 50 men, led by Adams and his allies, disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. Why the disguise? It wasn't just to hide their identities. The choice to dress as Native Americans was symbolic. It was a way to present themselves as outsiders to the British, making it clear that this was an act of rebellion by the people and not the elites. It also reflected a growing sense of American identity, independent from British influence. Step by step, the plan unfolded. The men gathered in the dark of night at the Old South Meeting House, where hundreds of patriots had gathered in anticipation. A final decision had to be made. Should they dump the tea or let the ships sail back to England? With a deafening cry of, "Boston Harbor is a teapot tonight," the decision was made. The group made their way down to the docks, where 3 ships, the Howe, Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, were docked, loaded with tea from the British East India Company. In unison, they boarded the ships, wielding axes and crowbars, and began smashing open the tea chests, each one containing 342 chests of tea worth over 10,000, a fortune at the time. The tea was thrown into the harbor, piece by piece, while the men worked quickly and methodically, ensuring they didn't leave a trace of their involvement. It was calculated chaos, a direct assault on the British economy. The whole event lasted about 3 hours, and by the end, the Boston Harbor was filled with over 90,000 pounds of tea floating in the water. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was an act of economic warfare, a direct challenge to British authority that would have far-reaching consequences. The dramatic visuals of crates crashing into the water, the night sky illuminated by lanterns, and the determined faces of the men who made history capture the sheer intensity of the moment. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just about tea. It was the spark that set the revolution ablaze. As dawn broke over the harbor, the message was clear. America wasn't going to bow to tyranny anymore. The Sons of Liberty had made their stand. The Boston Tea Party, while a bold act of defiance, set off a chain reaction that would forever alter the course of American history. The British response was swift and unforgiving. In retaliation, the British government passed a series of punitive measures known as the Intolerable Acts, or as the British called them, the Coercive Acts. These acts were designed to punish the colonies, particularly Massachusetts, and restore British control. The Coercive Acts, or Intolerable Acts as they were known to the colonists, were a series of punitive measures enacted by Britain in direct response to the Boston Tea Party. These acts were meant to force the rebellious city of Boston to pay for the destruction of the tea and to reassert British authority over the colonies. But far from quelling resistance, these measures only fueled the fire of rebellion. The most significant of the coercive acts was the closing of Boston Harbor. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a devastating blow to the entire colonial economy. Boston's harbor was one of the busiest and most vital trading ports in the colonies, and its closure meant the cessation of commerce, the loss of livelihoods, and the economic strangulation of the city. With no goods coming in and no goods going out, merchants, traders, and workers found themselves facing financial ruin. The closure was an attempt to force the colonists into submission by hitting them where it hurt most, their economy. But the effects were more than economic. The act symbolized punishment and humiliation. The British were sending a message. If the colonists resisted, they would pay a heavy price. Boston was being isolated, its citizens cut off from the rest of the user world, and forced to feel the consequences of their defiance. In a sense, the British were trying to make an example of Boston, to show the other colonies the price of rebellion. Along with the closure of the harbor came the imposition of military rule. General Thomas Gage, a British officer, was appointed the new governor of Massachusetts, and martial law was declared. British soldiers took control of Boston, occupying the streets, imposing curfews, and enforcing laws with a heavy hand. What had once been a thriving city was now under the thumb of a foreign military power. For the citizens of Boston, this was the ultimate betrayal. They weren't just being punished, they were being occupied. Their rights, their freedoms, and their autonomy were stripped away, and they were forced to live under the constant watch of British troops. This was not a simple law enforcement issue. This was a state of military occupation, a grim reality that reminded them they were now subjects, not citizens, under British control. This oppressive atmosphere only solidified the resolve of the colonists. Instead of breaking their spirit, the closure of Boston Harbor and the imposition of military law pushed the colonies closer together. The other colonies saw what was happening to Boston, and they began to offer support. What Britain thought would be a punitive action designed to subdue the colonies turned into the catalyst for revolution. The events that followed, the convening of the First Continental Congress, the creation of unified resistance, and the eventual military conflict, were all fueled by the heavy-handed tactics employed by the British. Rather than quelling dissent, the British actions ignited it, setting the stage for a war that would forever change the course of history. The closure of Boston Harbor and the military occupation of the city were not just symbols of British control, they were the breaking points that drove the colonies to seek independence. But this was not the end of the story. The American colonies, united by a shared desire for freedom, responded with an outpouring of support. Across the 13 colonies, people rallied to the cause. Virginia, South Carolina, and other colonies sent food and supplies to the besieged city. Colonists saw what was happening to Boston as a threat to them all. If the British could punish one colony this harshly, who would be next? In response, the colonies convened the First Continental Congress in 1774, a bold move toward unity. Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia to discuss how to respond to the British actions. They crafted a united front, adopting a Declaration of Rights and agreeing to a boycott of British goods, which would pave the way for further resistance. It was here, in the meeting rooms of Philadelphia, that the groundwork for a revolution was truly laid. The Tea Party, though seen by the British as an isolated event, had ignited a firestorm of resistance. The colonies, once divided by distance and differing interests, were coming together as a single force, united by the harsh British reaction and ready to take the next steps toward rebellion. This moment, the aftermath of the Tea Party, is the catalyst for what would come next. Open war. The intolerable acts were not just punishments, they were a declaration of British intent to control the colonies by force. In response, the colonies began to see independence as not just a possibility, but a necessity. Tensions mounted, and the path to war became inevitable. The American Revolution was no longer a distant thought. It was a looming reality. The opening shots would soon be fired, and the colonies would have no choice but to fight for the freedoms they had long been denied. The Boston Tea Party had sparked a rebellion, and now the struggle for independence was well underway. The Boston Tea Party was not just a pivotal moment in American history, it was a spark that ignited a global fire. While it might have started as an act of defiance in a single harbor, its impact was felt far beyond Boston's shores, inspiring resistance movements across the American colonies and even influencing colonial policies in other parts of the British Empire. Across the American colonies, the Boston Tea Party became a powerful symbol of resistance. In the wake of the British reaction, other colonies quickly mobilized, taking direct action to show their solidarity with Boston. Maryland, New York, and Pennsylvania all began organizing their own protests, and the committees of correspondence, secret networks of communication, spread word of the event throughout the colonies. By sharing information, strategies, and a common sense of injustice, the colonists began to view themselves as a united people, no longer divided by geography or local interests. This growing unity led directly to the formation of the First Continental Congress in 1774, where representatives from the colonies came together to create a coordinated resistance against British oppression. The events set in motion by the Tea Party helped push the colonies from simmering discontent to open rebellion, marking the beginning of a struggle that would culminate in the Declaration of Independence just a few years later. But the global impact of the Boston Tea Party was just as significant. British political leaders, especially within Parliament, were forced to reckon with the consequences of their actions. The harsh response to the colonies, particularly the intolerable acts, didn't sit well with everyone in Britain. Some members of Parliament began to question whether such heavy-handed measures were worth the cost. Sympathy for the colonists began to grow, with a few voices arguing that the colonies should be given more autonomy or that the punitive laws were only pushing them further toward rebellion. Over time, this shift in British politics would play a role in how Britain would deal with its other colonies, such as those in India and the Caribbean. The resistance shown by the American colonies put the British Empire on notice, forcing them to reconsider how they treated their subjects across the globe. Britain couldn't afford to let unrest spread from one colony to another, and soon, tensions in other parts of the empire would be viewed through the lens of what was happening in America. In places like India, the concept of colonial rights and resistance would continue to evolve in the years that followed. The principles of liberty and self-determination that emerged from the American Revolution would inspire movements for independence in the 19th and 20th centuries, shaping the global fight against colonial rule. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, where slavery was an entrenched part of the colonial economy, the Boston Tea Party and its aftermath would eventually find their echoes in struggles for freedom and rights that transcended borders. Even Britain's trade policies were affected. The disruption in American trade, especially with key markets like the West Indies, was significant. The Tea Party, though centered on one product, tea, was a microcosm of a much larger issue: Britain's need to control trade and its colonies. The loss of lucrative trade relationships, especially in the face of growing unrest, was something Britain could not ignore for long. In essence, the Boston Tea Party didn't just fuel the American Revolution, it helped create a ripple effect that would influence the future of global politics, trade, and colonial governance. What began as a single act of defiance in Boston set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the British Empire and inspire oppressed people around the world to challenge the systems that held them down. The Boston Tea Party was not just the beginning of American independence. It was the start of a global movement toward self-determination and liberty. While the Boston Tea Party has become one of the most iconic moments in American history, there are several myths that have been passed down through the years. Let's set the record straight and explore some surprising truths behind this pivotal event. Myth number 1. It was just a bunch of angry patriots dumping tea in the harbor. This couldn't be further from the truth. The Boston Tea Party was not a spontaneous outburst of anger. It was a carefully organized act of resistance, led by the Sons of Liberty, who had been planning this protest for months. It wasn't a chaotic mob, but a coordinated effort involving about 50 men who dressed as Mohawk Indians to symbolize their rejection of British control. The act was strategic and designed to make a statement, not just an emotional reaction to the tax on tea. Myth number 2. They destroyed the ships. Another misconception is that the colonists completely destroyed the ships involved. In fact, the protesters didn't destroy the ships. What they did was target the cargo. The tea was thrown into the harbor, but the ships themselves were left unharmed. The goal wasn't to sink the ships or cause widespread damage, but to send a message by destroying the tea, the symbol of British economic oppression. The ships were left intact, allowing them to return to England, but the tea was lost, valued at over $10,000, a staggering sum at the time. Myth number 3. The Boston Tea Party was all about the price of tea. While tea was certainly the catalyst, the Boston Tea Party was not just about the price of tea, it was about control. The Tea Act of 1773 gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants and threatening their livelihoods. For the colonists, it was more than just the cost of tea, it was about the principle of being taxed without representation, and the larger issue of British interference in colonial affairs. The protest was a symbolic rejection of British authority and control over the colonial economy, not simply a demand for cheaper tea. Surprising fact: what happened to the tea and the ship captains involved? Here's a lesser-known part of the weird story: the fate of the tea. After it was thrown into Boston Harbor, the tea didn't just float around waiting to be cleaned up. It became a lost treasure of sorts, with the British East India Company suffering a huge financial blow. But what happened to the ship captains? They were not punished in the way one might expect. In fact, the captains of the ships involved in the Tea Party, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, were not arrested or tried for the loss of their cargo. Interestingly, the British saw the destruction of the tea as an inconvenience, but they did not take harsh actions against the crew. Instead, the captains had to deal with the loss of their goods and were sent back to England to explain the situation to the British government. In reality, the Boston Tea Party was a calculated political act, not an angry outburst. It was about resisting control, fighting for economic independence, and standing up against British overreach. It set the stage for future acts of defiance that would ignite the American Revolution, and that legacy still shapes the fight for freedom and self-determination around the world today. The Boston Tea Party was more than just an act of defiance. It was the spark that ignited a fire that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. It marked the first time that the colonies openly defied British authority in such a bold and coordinated manner. What started as a protest against taxes became a global symbol of resistance to oppression, sending ripples of change far beyond Boston's shores. By challenging the British Empire, the colonists didn't just stand up for tea, they stood up for their rights, for their future, and for the very idea of liberty. The Boston Tea Party didn't just change the course of American history, it changed the course of world history. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in 1773? Would you have joined the protest, or would you have taken a different path? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, let's discuss, and be sure to check out our next video, What Happened After the Boston Tea Party, where we'll dive deeper into the consequences of this bold act and how it set the stage for war. Or if you're curious about the secret networks behind the revolution, don't miss the secret societies behind the revolution. As we close, here's a fitting quote from Thomas Paine, one of the great revolutionary thinkers. The harder the conflict, the greater the triumph. End with cinematic music and a dramatic visual of the Boston Tea Party scene fading out.